episode 51 of Grace and Steel. I'm Kevin Steele. This show, our special guest is pseudo-anonymous blogger and tweeter Bill Marchant. Bill is a member of Canada's nascent AltRight movement who started a blog called Northern Reaction. He speaks to my co-host, Kevin Michael Grace, about the political landscape above the 49th parallel and how he sees the alt-right developing in the Great White North.
So, Bill, I'm going to ask you the same question that I've asked many of the people that I've interviewed. How did you end up being identified with what we call the alt-right?
Well, it started with just reading. I tend to read absolutely everything that I can get my hands on. And I started to, I was on 4chan, actually, was the origin of all of this, and I wanted to have a conversation. I don't remember what it was about, on some historical topic, and I was told to go back to Poll, which is the politically incorrect board on 4chan, and I had never been there, and I was just asking what I thought were legitimate questions, and so I thought, okay, maybe there's some good conversation over here, and I went there, and I never went back from there. But at the same time, I was also reading kind of the neo-reaction, the reactosphere blogs and that kind of thing, like Mencius Moldbug and Michael Asinimov. Do you know if that's how you pronounce his name?
It sounds right.
Yeah. And tangential to that, Scott Alexander. And so, yeah, that all came together. And the impetus for actually going on to Twitter, as opposed to just remaining anonymous, was the Twitter profile, the Conservative Pundit. That did you ever follow the Conservative Pundit?
Oh, of course. He was wonderful.
Yeah. So I had just been browsing through his tweets constantly and always having to check back up for updates. So the reason why I created a Twitter profile was just to get updates from him. And I kind of built it from there, and started the blog, and just I had some time off, so I wanted to see what I could do.
Now, most of the people that I've asked this question have told me that they were either previously libertarians or neoconservatives, or in my own case, both. What was your experience?
I was never neoconservative. I had libertarian leanings, but it was closer to libertarianism plus Marx-Steinian defensive culture. That kind of thing. Sort of vaguely close to where Stefan Molyneux is right now. That's kind of where I...
What you mean? That's like the new criterion, say?
I'm not familiar with that, so I can't...
Oh, okay.
But just that individual liberty is very important, but there are certain things that are detrimental to individual liberty that, in order for overall individual liberty to be protected, you need some individual liberty to be restrained. There are compromises to be made there.
Well, no less than Sigmund Freud said that repression is the basis of civilization.
Well, that's very true.
Now, you are Canadian?
Yes. Yes, I am.
Born and raised here?
Both of those, yes.
And you come from central Canada?
Somewhere not too far north, south, or east. Or
okay.
sorry, not too far north, east, or west. So, yes.
I was born in Toronto myself, actually. I didn't spend very much time there. But I remember that Doug Christie always used to make a joke about this and say that, well, despite this, we'll allow you to remain here in Western Canada. The reason I bring this up is that I noted that there are few people that I would call conservative or genuinely conservative in Canada. That if you have read the media assiduously, say for the last decade or so, you will have noticed that all conservative voices have disappeared from the Canadian media. There aren't any left anymore.
Oh, absolutely.
There used to be a few. Now they're gone. In some cases, like Michael Corrin, well, they've done a 180, although Michael Corrin's got some weird thing going on there. So, I don't really know what his story is, although I have my suspicions. This is leading up to asking you, being a member of the alt-right in Canada, it's induces cognitive dissonance, does it not?
I don't think of it as cognitive dissonance. It's more planning for the future. Like in Canada, the way that the alt-right is now is what the alt-right was in the States like 10, 15 years ago. Something like that. Where they weren't even vaguely close to mainstream. They were just a couple of thinkers like Richard Spencer and the man that you had on your last show. Why am I not remembering his name?
Jared Taylor?
Jared Taylor. These are not necessarily, in the case of Jared Taylor, actually members of the alt-right, but kind of the intellectual seeds of that movement. And so there wasn't anything like that in the States back then. And there isn't anything like that in Canada right now. But I like to think of it as a growing group of people.
Well, every day in the Canadian media, there are a couple of pieces, and sometimes 4 or 5, about Donald Trump. And it's become clear to me that the purpose of these stories is to inform Canadians, don't be getting any strange ideas about these hideous ideas coming to this country, because it's not going to happen, because we're not going to let it happen. You have been warned.
I also see that very much so. I think that in order for something like the alt-right to flourish in Canada, it needs to take a very different direction than it did in the United States. I have read a couple of very interesting ideas for ways that it could sneak into Canadian politics without rocking the boat too much at first.
Well, we'll get to that in a minute. I'm looking at a piece that you wrote on Northern Reaction called Statement of Purpose, dated May the 19th.
Oh, yes. Going back in time now.
And you begin, Canada does not have anything approaching a viable nationalist movement or anything approaching America's alt-right or a European nouveau droit. We have a far-left party, the NDP, a center-left party in the Liberals, and a center-right party in the Conservatives. I would disagree with you here in that I don't consider the Conservatives to be a center-right party. I consider them to be a center-left party. And I suppose simply because it is so left-wing in this country that Stephen Harper's Conservatives, which got involved in anti-bullying efforts, which was touting Dan Savage's It Gets Better campaign. I could go on, but even Stephen Harper's Conservatives were denounced as being furiously right for the reason that they are not left-wing enough by Canadian standards. So why is Canada so paused?
Well, that's an excellent question. And first off, to the center-left comment, I would agree with you depending on the political spectrum that we're talking about. We have to remember that the political spectrum that we're fed in, for example, school, saying that like the left-wing radicals are the kind of the future and the like Mitt Romney as far right as anything goes. There are so many thinkers far, far to the right of that, and so many thinkers far, far to the left of that, like Julius Evola, Maestra, de Maestra. There's the actual political spectrum is just so huge that everything, all modern politics, is reasonably far to the left.
Well, I'll give you an example, and this will help our American listeners, because, of course, almost all our listeners are Americans. Someone like Ross Douthat,
yes,
who is regularly derided on the alt-right as a typical New York Times stooge. He's quite an intelligent man, clearly.
Yes.
Ross Douthat is far to the right of anything that would be allowed in the Canadian media, and he writes for the New York Times.
That is true. Yes, if we are comparing it to the American political spectrum, then I would absolutely agree with you that the Conservatives are center-left, 100%. I think that the argument could be made that they're further left than the Democrats.
Oh, I don't think there's any question about that. What do you make of Ezra Levant's The Rebel Group?
I think it depends on which efforts we're talking about. I quite enjoyed Shakedown. That was Levant, right? Yes.
Yes.
I quite enjoyed that book. I thought that it brought up a number of issues that needed to be talked about. And as for the Rebel, I see it as pushing the Overton window. Like, I don't agree with them politically exactly, but I think that because they are popular and appealing to the young people type thing, that they are doing something that needs to be done. Whether they're the best people to be doing it, it still needs to be done.
Well, going back to the question of why Canada is so paused, it's arguable that Canada was a more conservative country than the United States up until the 1960s. I mean, Social Security in the United States existed for decades before Canada had a similar program, to give one example. But this idea that, well, of course, Canada, we're the people who do all the right things, and the right thing is having the government run everything and having the government bully everyone. This is a fairly modern idea in Canadian terms. Why do you think that it came about?
Well, I think it's a shift from... I think that we always had a much greater trust in the government than the United States did. We were always more government-oriented, but we stopped being right-wing government-oriented and started being left-wing government-oriented. Trudeau and Pearson did a sort of bait-and-switch, where they got us to, okay, you like statist behavior, you like sort of semi-right-wing statist behavior, we'll give you semi-left-wing statist behavior, and then super left-wing statist behavior. Whereas in the United States, they were always much, much less trusting of the state. So their right-wing was always fighting against more state intervention for the most part. They were less successful, though, than we were until more recently.
Well, I've argued in the past, and I continue to maintain, that Canada's always been a consensus country, but Pierre Trudeau, and before him Lester Pearson, very cleverly or devilishly turned this idea on its head. That what happened under the Pearson-Trudeau regime was that everything that used to be Canadian was no longer Canadian, and that, especially with Trudeau, we were told, and we hear to this day, here's a list of positions. If you do not agree with these positions, you are not a real Canadian and you are a traitor, essentially.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Why has there been no resistance to this? Because I'll just say that a lot of people see Preston Manning's Reform Party as an example of resistance, but I don't. He was so populist in the sense of from the ground up, or grassroots, a word that he just worked to death. And that Preston Manning, it turns out, was obsessed by process. And his obsession with process motivated him in a way that's difficult for me to understand. I mean, I have followed this man's career for some time, and I have written about it at length and studied it, and I have no idea what he's about, honestly.
I can...
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say I can totally see that.
Well, why do you think there's been so little resistance? I mean, we read about some comedian being fined, what is it, $42,000 for making a joke?
Just too much money. That was insane.
If you look at the Scott Brocky case, we've had similar cases involving cakes in the United States, and this resulted in ferocious reaction. Whereas the reaction in Canada seemed to be, hey, get with the program, pal. If you don't want to further the gay agenda, then you should just leave the business world.
Well, I think that what's going on is we don't have someone to model off of. The United States, and this has been talked about at length in, Unqualified Reservations, the Mencius Moldbug blog, that there is nothing approaching the kind of red state in the United States in Europe. There was at the time that he was writing. It's sort of getting a little bit better now, but there was nothing approaching the disagreement over the core values, not just about the end results or how best to get there, but disagreement over the core values that the United States has anywhere else basically in the world besides Chile under Pinochet. And so we don't have the reason why the United States could get away with that is because they've always had these thought leaders. They were started as it's cliched now, but proposition nation. They were started as this group of people just trying to create the best nation possible. They weren't evolving before that. They have this point to go off of. And so they have these thought leaders, these politicians and people that can philosophize and give them directions to go that aren't just becoming more and more left-wing. And they don't always or even frequently go in those directions, but it's something that they have. Whereas in Canada, our options were, after 1960, after the bait and switch was fully in force, our options were either become more left-wing or become more like the United States. And we have this visceral reaction against becoming more like the United States because we are Canada, and we're basically the only thing that the world knows about us is that we are not the United States, not quite the United States. So,
well, of course, yes, we know that. But we tell ourselves that the rest of the world is deeply in love with Canada, and apparently Tanzanian peasants, sitting around the dinner table, speak of little else but Canada.
Well, we're told that, and that's because we're being used as a model for... my next blog post is going to be about how Canadian multiculturalism was used as a model for the failed European multiculturalism. We are the testing ground, because we don't have the immediacy of the history that Europe does. The thinkers and the kind of left-wing politicians, they can use us as a testing ground for their ideas to see which ones work best to drive things further left. So we will generally get gay marriage before other people. We'll generally get multiculturalism before other people. We'll get all of these things because as I said, we don't have the visceral, right there history of castles and things, and this isn't what we were, that Europe has, and we don't have that red state kind of, not insurrection, but resistance that the United States has. So for the left-wing intellectuals, we're the perfect testing ground.
How much of this is a West-East divide? I'll mention, listeners of this podcast will know this. I worked for a decade or so for this magazine, which was called Alberta Report. And they had a magazine called BC Report and another magazine called Western Report. And at one time, these magazines had, close to 100,000 subscribers in Western Canada. And the people in Eastern Canada were simply not interested in the magazine. I mean, we covered national politics. We covered stories across Canada. But this came from Alberta, I suppose, and no, we're not interested in any of that. These people in Alberta with their crazy views. I'm not asking you to tell me why Alberta Report was a failure in Eastern Canada, but we did have a genuinely right-wing magazine in Canada, which was rather successful for some years, and as I say, it had no effect in Eastern Canada at all. Why would you think that would be the case?
I'm not really sure. I think that a part of that is the kind of another thing that the liberal politicians of the 60s were very good at was convincing us that the CBC was our voice, that they represented the Canadian views and anything else was at best regional views. And part of that was the infiltration of the CBC by communists. I don't know how many people know that, but there were charges laid because communists from the USSR got into management positions on the CBC. But that might speak to what happened there, that the people in Eastern Canada saw this as a regional paper, so we don't want to hear what that region is saying. CBC will tell us about Canada, and we'll have our own region tell us about our region. So because they have, again, unlike in the States, they don't have that, besides possibly the New York Times, they don't have that thing, that paper or that broadcasting outlet that is everyone's. that is what it belongs to the entire nation.
Well, the Wall Street Journal, you could say that as well.
But again, it's in the same way that the New York Times is. It's not speaking to rural Alabama, but everyone across Canada that doesn't realize exactly what the CBC is doing thinks of the CBC as Canada's broadcasting corporation. It is ours.
Yeah, I suppose so. It's just that with regard to Canadian TV, the Canadian TV produced by the CBC, it's been so bad for so long that I don't know anyone who watches it.
When I go to a somewhere like a university and they have a television on, it is always on the CBC. The CBC is like the default for where you're going to get your news. It's the default for where you're getting the information from. And again, this is besides the people that actually know all of the things that go on in the CBC. For example, did you see that the No White Males Need Apply posting for the CBC Kids show?
Yes.
Yeah. So that kind of thing. The people that know about that kind of thing, you and I and the people on the alt-right in Canada on Twitter, know that they shouldn't trust the CBC. But I think that in the general population, there's a lot more people that just blindly follow it because they think, oh, it's paid for, so it's not bought off by corporations, so it must be neutral.
I remember when I met David Frum about 20 years ago. Charming fellow, by the way.
Yeah.
And we quickly got into this kind of silly argument over who started reading National Review first or who started reading the American Spectator first. And I found that when you talk to Canadian conservatives of a certain age, their conservatism comes from the United States exclusively. That what we would describe as Canadian conservatism is a rather sad branch plant operation of Conservatism, Inc. Did you read that old Alberta Report essay that I sent you, Does the Right Hate Canada?
Yes, I did get a chance to look at that, and I believe that I've read that before. That rang a couple of bells for me.
Well, it became notorious because Paul Wells wrote a book blaming me for Harper's winning campaign strategy. Essentially, what Harper took from my essay was, we have to fake being Canadian patriots if we're going to succeed here.
And it worked.
It did work. It did work, and I suppose I am now a footnote to history in that regard. But don't you find it odd that when we talk about Canadian conservatism, we're really talking about the United States?
I think it's odd, but I think it's the natural progression from what happened with Trudeau. I think that he did a very, very good job of changing the conversation from what was traditionally Canadian conservatism into your options are go our way or go with the States. And Canadian conservatives, by and large, went with the States. The one thing that I'd like to say, though, is that I think that unlike American conservatives, we were talking earlier about the breadth of the political spectrum. American conservatives have the hard wall at the American Revolution. They can't be more right-wing than the Founding Fathers were. They can't signal more right-wing than the Founding Fathers were without signaling also another revolution. Whereas in Canada, we don't have that hard wall. We have just simple progression from all the way back in 1066 with Britain to today, and there's no hard wall that we would have to stop at. We can say that we want an actual functioning monarchy. We can say that. That's just not something that will probably ever enter the American discourse. So we have more room than the Americans have, even though we're not taking advantage of it.
I'm much older than you, and when I was a boy, a young man, Canada was still recognizably British in culture outside Quebec. This infuriated Pierre Trudeau and infuriated the Liberal Party. They set out to destroy it. I mean, if you look at CBC television in the 1960s, they were playing all these British comedy shows like The Frost Report and such like, that British books, novels dominated the bestseller lists. That British music that was never played on American radio, was all over Canadian radio. Trudeau and the Liberals succeeded in destroying Canada's British culture. I believe in the belief that a new Canadian culture would rise up in its place, but it's my belief that this never happened. Instead, we simply got swallowed by the Americans culturally.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think that there was that opportunity there, and I think that in the next little while there will be another opportunity. That's my prediction for you can hold me to that someday far in the future, but I think that within the next decade we are going to have another opportunity to do that, to craft a kind of truly Canadian culture that isn't British or American or whatever's going on now.
You mentioned Canadian values. Now, this is a phrase, whenever I hear this, I release the safety on my Browning. Because whenever you're told about Canadian values, you're going to be told something outrageous and evil. Just to give you an example, I got a lot of response, from Africa, which is unusual, to something I posted on Twitter, saying that the only memorable thing that Trudeau said was, "Where's Biafra?" Millions of people were being starved to death, an effort that all of the Western powers were in favor of, and Trudeau decided to laugh at this. Now, I came across this piece by a senior Canadian diplomat, written a couple of years ago, where he said that this was not said in the narrow spirit of rich country indifference. To Trudeau, Canada's interest stood behind doing what was reasonable and was rooted in Canadian values. It was not an either-or choice for him. We do both. Oh, so apparently Canadian values are supporting Jocko Wan in his campaign to destroy Biafra, having wrecked the federal system of Nigeria and starving people, millions to death, in order to bring the Biafrans to heel. Now, it was clear that Trudeau thought, oh my God, if these Biafrans become independent, then maybe the Quebecois will get the same idea. But if you look at for instance, gay marriage, in 1999 it was, Preston Manning did a clever thing, which is he forced a vote in the House of Commons on gay marriage. And Chrétien, Prime Minister Chrétien at the time, and almost all of the Liberal cabinet ministers voted against it. And the reaction from the Liberal Party is, yeah, that's just typical. That's just typical that this outrageous idea of gay marriage that nobody supports, the slippery slope argument, the paranoia of the right in Canada, and then within 5 years, this boutique enthusiasm had become a fundamental Canadian value.
Oh, absolutely. That one I wouldn't say is strictly Canadian, because that's exactly what happened with Hillary Clinton. That she was fundamentally opposed to gay marriage in, I don't remember when that interview was, 1998, 1999, somewhere like that. And now she's been a champion of gay rights for decades. And
oh, sure, but I meant it's more dishonest in Canada because there's no. Well, of course, we're in favor of gay marriage because we're Canadian.
I see. We've always been at war with.
East Asia or whatever.
Yeah.
But this is one of the things that's so maddening about living in this country. And going back to this question of why Canada is so paused, I don't recall that Canadians were always so cowardly as they are now. I mean, there's all sorts of people who are successful enough, influential enough, or rich enough to indicate that, maybe our headlong, quest for endless globalization and social revolution, maybe we should take a pause and just examine this. But no, full speed ahead. We must do that, and I don't want to be a contrary voice because, God knows what would happen.
Yeah, and that speaks to what you were saying before about us being a consensus nation, that we think that everyone else thinks this way, so no one is standing up and saying, I think the other way. There's, at most, from the Conservatives, token resistance to any issue that the Liberals want. Like, Stephen Harper was in power for, how long was it, 9 years?
9 years.
9 years. And what got further right in Canada Was there anything that we actually went to the right on, as opposed to just didn't go to the left?
Well, it depends on how you define right. I mean, Harper and his admirers, who are legion,
Sorry, yeah,
would
yes,
say
yeah.
would say that our devotion to our idiotic military adventure in Afghanistan would show how right-wing Stephen Harper was, or his bizarre obsession with Israel would prove how right-wing he was. You know, I don't know how familiar you are with this, but it was the stated position of all Canadian governments, both conservative or liberal, that we supported UN resolution, I think it's 242 on the West Bank, that the occupied territories were to be returned. And then, I know that Stockwell Day, the leader of the Canadian Alliance, was pushing this. But this idea that if you do not support the Likud party, then you're an anti-Semite. And Israel, again, bizarrely, became central to Canadian politics in the way that it's been central to American politics for decades.
I don't know what to say about Israel.
Well, no, I'll say this. I'll clarify my position. I've always been a supporter of Israel, but it's really not important to us. It's not important for all sorts of reasons. And the United States, for better or worse, is the military and monetary guarantor of the state of Israel.
Yes.
We are not in that position, and we could never be in that position.
No.
So why did it become such a big deal here? I just see this as another example of how our so-called right is just in a rush to embrace everything that Conservatism Inc. does in the United States.
Yeah, and I think that when I said that we didn't go further right, what I was referring to was more the sort of nationalistic right as opposed to the neoconservative right. I wouldn't argue with anyone that wanted to say that Stephen Harper got us closer to the American Conservative Inc. ideal of this right-wing place to be for now until we go further left when the left-wing party gets into power. But as for making permanent changes to the way of the world in Canada, like Justin Trudeau is doing, there was nothing like that. Like even commitments to Israel or military intervention in Afghanistan, when the new people come into power, we can just withdraw from those things. Justin Trudeau, if he wants to, can just stop bombing the bombings that we did. Those Syrian bombings, we were bombing Syria, right? Not Libya?
Oh, well, yeah, but Justin Trudeau seems a case of meet the new boss same as the old boss. I mean, he's the neoliberal yin to the neoconservative yang of Stephen Harper.
No, but
I mean, we're at war with the whole world all the time, apparently.
What I mean is that we don't have... I could see Justin Trudeau insisting that something about our Charter of Rights and Freedoms or our Constitution is currently bad and needs to get changed, and either pushes that through the court and just getting the right judges to take the right case, the right Supreme Court judges to take the right case, or through actually going through the process of the amending formula and fundamentally making sure that it can never go back. And I don't think that there was anything that Stephen Harper did that he had any intention of staying that way after he left, or that he made any efforts to make sure stayed that way after he left. And the things that will stay that way, as you said, they're just further globalization. They're further interventionist wars. They're further these things that I don't care about. I just don't care. Why are we doing this?
Well, here's something I'm sure you do care about. That the Conservative Party has decided that it's going to be a race to disaster in terms of immigration. How much less Canadian can we make this country? And the Conservatives say we win, and the Liberals say we win.
Now, there's a losing game. I'm sure that you've seen the Stefan Molyneux charts for which groups in the United States. I don't think that he's done anything for Canada. But which groups in the United States vote for the Democrats and the Republicans. And the Republicans are almost exclusively white men. That's by far the largest group. Next largest is white women. And then I think that Asian men is at something like 20% of Asian men or 30% of Asian men, and everyone else is in the teens somewhere. So any kind of mass immigration that isn't from Europe, which Europe can't immigrate to Canada, there aren't enough Europeans, they're having their own problems with that.
Well, no, it's almost impossible for white Europeans to immigrate to Canada even if they want to.
Well, that too, yeah. But there's no winning solution for the Conservatives, because the best that they're going to do is they are going to have a glut of immigration, and that one generation will remember that it was the Conservatives that let them in, and they will vote Conservative. And that one generation will vote Conservative, and then the next generation will regress to the mean and not remember why their parents voted Conservative, and it will continue to go Liberal further and further until the end of time. So that
in the 2011 election, the Conservatives were crowing, and they continue to crow to this day, and the pundits say, yeah, get back to the wisdom of 2011. The visible minorities in Canada voted more than 2-1 for the parties other than the Conservative Party, and the Conservatives see this as a great victory. One asks the question, do they know how arithmetic works? Because if they don't know how arithmetic works, then there's something else at play here. I see someone like Jason Kenney.
Yes.
And there is this mad desire to be seen as not a racist. And I'm going to be not a racist by, in fact, going so far as to accuse the Liberals of being racists.
Well, absolutely. Now, I will be honest, I do have a soft spot in my heart for Jason Kenney. He follows...
Why?
He follows a particular Twitter account that I quite enjoy, that I wasn't expecting him to follow. I won't give more details than that on air because I don't want him to get in trouble, but I'm quite happy that he's following that particular account. But you're right, absolutely, that there is the idea that we need to appear not racist. That is something that it has infected their minds, and it goes back to the conservative pundit Twitter account that his Twitter handle was "Dems are the real racist, Democrats are the real racist," because he said that the reason why he did that was because that exemplified the so-called conservative mindset, that they have entirely absorbed the liberal worldview, and their only argument with liberalism is that they don't do a good enough job at being liberal, and that conservatives can be liberal better than even liberals.
Well, I have it on very good authority from more than one source. So that Stephen Harper's goal, and apparently he got this from his guru, Tom Flanagan, that there's only room in Canada for one natural governing party. And for decades, for most of Canada's history, that had been assumed to be the Liberal Party. But that Harper was going to make the Conservatives the natural governing party, and he was going to do this by essentially subsuming Canadian liberalism. Now, if you want jobs in government, this is a worthy goal. But if you're interested in anything else, why?
Yeah.
Why would you want to do that?
And it's the position of the conservatives in the States. That's exactly it, is that they think that the way to appeal to non-white voters is by making themselves the liberal option, the truly liberal option. And it just can't be done. It's not a winning strategy. It's a race to the bottom that they're going to lose, because there's no limit to how far left the liberals will go. If the conservatives end up going further to the center, the liberals will just go further left and accuse them of being racist again. It's just going to keep happening. The problem is that liberals are playing chicken while conservatives are playing the iterated prisoner's dilemma. So the conservatives think, okay, I'm going to cooperate with the liberals this time, and then next time they'll cooperate with me. Whereas the liberals are saying, I'm going to keep going. I'm just going to keep going. If you want to keep going, I'll keep going, until the conservatives blink and think that, okay, this one time they didn't cooperate with me, but I guess I just have to cooperate all that much harder next time. So they're playing two completely different games, and the Conservative strategy right now just can't win. There's no way for it to win.
Well, even if you won, you'd have lost, because the Canada that would result would be something terrible. I mean, Vancouver and Toronto are essentially non-Canadian cities now.
Yeah.
And for some time now, during election campaigns, the issues that motivate the voters in these non-European settlements, colonies, which have been created in Vancouver and Toronto, are essentially tribal issues, which are conducted in languages other than English.
Absolutely.
I mean, Stephen Harper, to give one example, and this is, I wasted all these years railing against Paul Martin and the Liberal government's support of the Tamil terrorists. And then Stephen Harper becomes prime minister, and oh my God, we got like 250,000 of these people in Greater Toronto, so we can't get on the wrong side of them. So we're going to boycott the Commonwealth meeting in Sri Lanka just to show that we're on the side of the Tamil terrorists. This is just appalling behavior.
No, absolutely. And it's not something that they're going to win, because the Indonesians aren't going to vote Conservative anyway. Even if you do all of the proper prostrating, they're still not going to vote for you. It's just not a winning strategy. There was a quote a while ago that said that all politics is identity politics, but people in the United States, white people in the United States, have been spared from realizing that because they have been the largest voting bloc. So they could pretend to themselves that identity politics weren't a part of it because we're mostly white. But that is coming to an end, and it's coming to an end quickly.
Well, Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore famously said that in multicultural countries, people vote on a tribal basis. Now, one would think that people would pay attention to Lee Kuan Yew, considering the history of Malaysia and Singapore.
Oh, yeah.
This is another one of the things that irritates me so greatly about this benighted country, is that we pretend that we know so much more about the world than the Americans, and we know very little about the world, and we could care less.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think that I've ever met anyone in my day-to-day life that has ever known who Lee Kuan Yew was. I can't think of a single person besides maybe a world history professor.
My first longtime boss at the University of British Columbia I worked for years was a Chinese Catholic from Malaysia. Mm-hmm. And he'd been a civil servant. He'd been a chief health inspector in Borneo. And he was shelving books in the university library, as I was. And I asked him why he'd come to Canada, and I was curious because he was boasting about his, Cambridge equivalency degrees and his high position. And he told me the story about how the ethnic Malays, the Muslims, decided that these Chinese were getting too big for their boots, and they were going to bring them to heel, which they did, and he decided to get the hell out of there. And I wondered whether he was bitter about this, ending up shelving books in a Canadian library, and he wasn't bitter at all. He was just grateful to have gotten away from possibly being blown up in an airplane. And the things that he told me, I mean, he didn't bother to hide his prejudices, that he thought that the Malays were feckless, lazy, and sensual. And he once shocked me. He loved to say this. He said, Kevin, in Malaysia, we have a saying, sooner trust a snake in the grass than trust an Indian. By that he meant the Sikhs.
Yes.
And this is the way of the world, going back to this question of multiculturalism. But we have the best magic dirt in the world here in Canada, because once people get to Canada, they just stop acting as they do everywhere else in the world, apparently.
Magically, yeah.
Yeah, magically. Hey, let's talk about the future now.
Okay.
I have maintained that there is a huge gap in Canadian politics for a patriot/nationalist option. Do you think that anyone will run for the Conservative Party leadership who will epitomize this?
I don't think they will win. I don't know if anyone will run for that, but I'm almost positive that the Conservative Party is too ingrained in the kind of neoconservative Harperism to actually be able to shift that way. I don't think that there's room for that, especially not right now. What my thinking, and what I read an article, and I don't remember where, a while ago, describing this, but this person's argument was that it's going to be the Bloc Québécois. That the Bloc Québécois in the next little while, if everything goes well, will expand into something like le Bloc Provincial and become a sort of provincial nationalist party. And nationalism will sneak into Canadian politics through Quebec nationalism, which we're sort of okay with. And it's just about the only kind of nationalism that is okay in a European originated country is Quebec nationalism, because they are the minority. So that was kind of the argument there, and sort of the impetus would be someone like Trump. This was written a couple of years ago. Someone like Trump bringing things further to the right in the United States in a direction that they hadn't really seen before, and that people on the Canadian side would be sort of inspired by this to do something similar but uniquely Canadian.
Well, I'm worried about a wolf in sheep's clothing effect there, because after Thatcher won in 79 and after Reagan won in 1980, Brian Mulroney went around the country telling everyone that Canada was becoming just like Sweden and we had to do something about this. It was time for a change. And then he became prime minister, and what he proceeded to do was to consolidate all of the changes that the Pearson-Trudeau regime had brought about. And he gave us wonderful things like affirmative action.
Yeah, I'm not claiming like that this is... I thought that the article made some good points, but I don't think that it's a guarantee. But I think that that's just about the only chance that we have of that. As I said, I don't think that the Conservatives have it in them to go far enough right that they'll actually be useful.
Well, I look at the Conservative Party now, and I look at people like Rona Ambrose and Michel Rempel, and these are whiny children. Oh, I'm discriminated against because I'm a woman. Have pity on me. Support me. Oh, it's just been so difficult as a woman. And these people have gone so far that it's impossible for me to take them seriously. And frankly, I don't think that if the Conservatives follow the advice from the media and they decide to out-Trudeau, that this will result in political oblivion. Not that I would shed any tears over that.
But it would be oblivion from our perspective. In 20 years after that's happened, there'll still be a Conservative Party. It will just be basically Justin Trudeau 5 years from now, instead of Justin Trudeau 20 years from now. We're just going to keep moving further and further left. And
well, yeah, except I guess the final thing I wanted to ask you about is, can Canada survive? And I mean that seriously. If you look at Canada now, Canada's in no sense a nation. Well, no. We formally granted nationhood to the Québécois. The rest of us aren't allowed to have a nation. You have Atlantic Canada, or the Gibbs-me-dat provinces, as I like to call them.
Yes.
We have Quebec, we have Ontario, we have the Prairie provinces, we have British Columbia, and we have the North. That's 6 regions which have little in common with each other. And there's a fight for diminishing resources. Alberta is going to be a have-not province soon enough. Mm-hmm. And therefore, presumably, British Columbia, all on its Todd, will be paying for the rest of Canada. And that can't work, can it?
I think that the only way that it can work is doing that Parti Provincial, having a provincial rights party that's going to strip the federal government of all of the power that it has and turn Canada into what the United States was originally envisioned as being, which was mostly autonomous regions, self-governing regions with a federal government to do sort of minimalist tasks, things that they couldn't do by themselves, like national defense, as opposed to what we have now, which is the nanny state. So I think that the kind of only way out of that, when we are, as you say, we're completely different regions and completely different mindsets in each of the regions, the only way around that is to have decentralization of the government, and then each of the provinces can govern themselves in the way that they see fit, as opposed to what the federal government thinks is best for them, and leeching off of each other.
Well, I'm wondering whether this could come about because of a reaction against the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled in 2002 that a school board couldn't make certain decisions if the members of the school board held religious opinions. The Supreme Court has legalized euthanasia. It has legalized prostitution. Stephen Harper's conservatives decided that they didn't want to get involved in a quarrel about the powers of the Supreme Court, and they like this idea because decisions that would have been unpopular, well, it's not, hey, nothing to do with us, the Supreme Court did it. And I wonder if we might be heading towards a position where some prime minister or a bunch of premiers are going to say that Justice McLaughlin has made her decision, now let her enforce it.
I hope so. Don't get me started on the Supreme Court. There are so many things that worry me about that, and I think that you're absolutely right that could very well be another impetus for rebellion, almost. The Supreme Court decision, if we're getting on that really sticks out for me, is the Whatcott case. Do you know anything about the Whatcott?
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah. So for those who don't know, Whatcott was...
Bill Whatcott, that was his name, right?
Yes. He was distributing leaflets giving facts about homosexuals, and he was taken before the Canadian Saskatchewan Human Rights Tribunal, and his argument in his defense was for hate speech law violations, and his argument in his defense was, how can this be hate speech? Everything that I'm saying is true. He gave statistics about AIDS rates in the gay community and things like that. And his defense was, this can't be hate speech because it's all true. I'm not lying. And the Supreme Court decided that truth is not a defense against hate speech. And that scares me more than almost any other decision in any Western court in the world, because there is no limit to what you can do with hate speech laws now. If truth isn't a defense against a hate speech charge, then there is no wall that we can go up against, where, like in the United States, where you can just say what I'm saying is true, and then you can say whatever you want if you can prove that it's true. In Canada, we don't have that, so the government can enforce whatever kind of, or more the Supreme Court, can insist that the government enforce whatever kind of radical speech limitations that they want.
Well, I'll give you a scenario. That Trudeau brings in legislation citing the war on terror, or the war on terrorism, whatever we're calling it these days, and lumping in the extreme right with this, and therefore effectively saying that people like you and I are no longer allowed to use the internet, and if you attempt to use it surreptitiously, we will put you in prison.
Yeah, and the other part of our wonderful jurisprudence that would actually let that happen is, in order to bring forward a Canadian human rights case, you need to be part of a recognized group. And straight white males are not part of a recognized group. So I and you and many other people in Canada just simply could not bring forward a claim because we don't have a basis by which to say we have been discriminated against. We aren't a group that can be discriminated against in Canada. And yeah, I worry about that all the time. That is.
Well, I'll give you another example, and this pertains to Canada's economic future. That the courts in Canada, despite the fact there's nothing about this in our Constitution, have been giving these very great but undefined rights to Native people with regard to the resource industries.
Yes.
We are now at the risk of losing our oil and gas and mining industries. And the Liberals, of course, they're like the NDP in Alberta. These jobs are yucky. Horrible men do them. And this isn't the innovation economy. And there was little or no defense of this from the Harper government. I mean, if you look at the Harper government, and, you know, I'm not picking on them, but if you look at Rona Ambrose is a very good example. Stephen Harper is another example himself. These people have led their lives entirely in politics. They have little or no whatsoever experience in the private sector. And again, they don't seem to know where money comes from, how wealth is created. They seem to believe that there's some sort of money shack, that you just go to the money shack if you need more money. And I spent several years writing about the mining industry, and I came to the conclusion that I would advise people to go to Mexico. Yeah, it's a failing narco state, but you can protect your interests better there than you can in British Columbia.
That's true. And I think that that's an artifact of the Americanization of the right, is the use of debt to sort of prop up what's going on. The kind of Reaganomics outlook of it. We'll cut taxes, but we'll just print more money. We're not going to actually cut services or anything. We're just going to go deeper in debt. And so that is definitely something that people like Stephen Harper seem to be fine with. And
well, it's an odd, disquieting position to conclude that the only hope for one's country is, in effect, its dissolution.
Balkanization.
In one form or another. But I look at Ontario. Ontario is far worse off economically than California or Illinois, and no one in this country seems to care.
Yeah. Every election, every provincial election that I've been here for has blown my mind that the Liberals are still in power. I can't believe it. It's still...
Well, you have the Premier of Ontario, who, as I like to joke, resembles the woman that Hansel and Gretel found inside the gingerbread house, who has pretty much admitted that, yeah, sure, my government sells influence for money. What are you going to do about it?
Oh, absolutely.
And again, this doesn't seem to be anything that the great and the good of this country care very much about.
No, and I don't remember the exact law of it, but there's some elections loophole that allows unions to in Ontario to donate however much they want to political campaigns, or run as many ads as they want, or something like that. And we're the only Western region, we're the only region in Canada, and nowhere in the States does it, and nowhere else does it. There's always limits to how much groups can contribute to an election, except for in Ontario. So all throughout the last however many years, whenever the unions are on, or whenever the Liberals are on the union's good side, they just get free advertising, and no limits on how much free advertising.
I'll conclude with this. Peter Brimelow, who lived for some years in Canada, I suppose he's always been rather wary about having stuff about Canada on VDare because it's rather depressing. And whenever I've written for VDare, he was always on at me to try and find something hopeful in the situation. So I'm going to ask you what you think is hopeful in our situation.
I think the people. I think that the Canadian people have a lot more resilience than a lot of the other people around the world do. I think that despite the efforts of the Liberals in the 60s and everyone after that, I think that we're still of the stock that survived the winters here. I think that we still have that in us, and there are still enough of us that did that whatever is going to happen long term, if something like a world war breaks out and it's a literal global war, I think that we will be one of the last to fall.
You're supposed to be hopeful, and you're talking about World War.
It's I don't know how to describe it, but it's resigned hope that there's more to us than the changes that have been made to us are not permanent. That in the worst case scenario, we will still survive. Whereas I'm not that confident about other places. I think that, for example, Europe can't necessarily say that. They could be completely overrun. I don't see Canada ever being completely overrun.
Well, how about my idea that Canada is a multicultural, multinational, multilingual empire, and that it is destined to go the way of, say, the Austro-Hungarian Empire?
I could definitely see that happening. I would still say that Hungary is still around, Austria is still around, they aren't as powerful as they were, obviously, but they still exist, and they were able to survive. And I think that would be more true of Canada. We might balkanize, we might collapse, but the people would still survive. The people would find a way to survive. I think that we have survival in our DNA.
Well, I mean, if you look at the situation with Austria and Hungary now, Hungary seems to have established itself as amazingly a home for Hungarians.
Yes, and Austria is looking to do the same with their presidential election. They threw out a vote that was rigged, and I wasn't expecting them to do that. Everyone knew that it was rigged. Everyone knew that the presidential election, they magically found these mail-in ballots at the last second that pushed the the Green Party or former Green Party candidate over the top above the right-wing candidate, and the court in Austria actually threw out the election, and they're having to do a re-election. So that was
yes,
nice.
As I like to say, postal voting. We bring the fraud to you. Anyway, Bill Marchant, it's been a delight. Thanks so much, and I hope we can talk again.
Thank you very much for having me.